children, have you ever met the bogeyman before? No, of course you haven't, for you're much too good, I'm sure. Don't you be afraid of him if he should visit you. He's a great big coward, so I'll tell you what to do. Hush, hush, hush. Here comes the bogeyman.
The term found footage is thrown around a lot now in the Hollywood scene, and it's no surprise why. Films like Cloverfield and Paranormal Activity set a standard after the initial success of the Blair Witch Project that not only do audiences enjoy the material, these films succeed at the box office with major payback. In fact, this summer saw the release of a new found footage film, The Gallows, which completely smashed its break-even point on a budget of $100,000 and dominated ad space for a while. Before that came Unfriended, a film I personally saw in theaters that took place entirely on a computer screen during a Skype call from hell. Rarely do we have films that are actually about found footage though, and when Sinister launched in theaters 3 years ago under that premise, it impressed critics and audiences with fresh storytelling and an original take on an old legend. Not to mention, it was actually scary. Sinister was a strong horror film that knew how to play suspense and intrigue while never forgetting characters and genuine human behavior was important for any medium of fiction. I've been looking forward to Sinister 2 since the night I got home after viewing Sinister and spent a few hours researching the Bagul and found footage films. The chance to view the sequel finally came tonight, and I was lucky enough to see it before the typical midnight release at my local theater. The first Sinister film was directed by Scott Derrickson, who also wrote the film alongside Christopher Robert Cargill. Too often, major sequels of horror franchises are passed to different writers, which can really wreck the drive of a continuing story. I'm happy to say Scott Derrickson and Chris Cargill came back to write Sinister 2, but there's a new director in the seat by the name of Ciaran Foy. Writing is the core of any film, but directing will always determine just how much of that writing is utilized and in what way. The mix of Sinister's original writers with a new director explains why the result of Sinister 2 is closer to what we've come to expect of horror movie sequels than what we got in the first installment. Sinister 2 picks up shortly after the events of Sinister with a story driven by a surprise main character. The deputy who helped true crime writer Ellison Oswalt with his investigation in the first film, played by actor James Ronson. The death of Ellison Oswalt and his family by the hands of a paranormal entity led the deputy to pick up the pieces of Ellison's investigation and find the truth, which leads him to an abandoned home where one of the infamous family killings took place. There, he finds a single mother living with her 2 boys who are on the run from an abusive father she's trying to keep from gaining custody. You may have guessed as much about the events taking place in this getaway house from the trailers, which reveal a little bit too much of what's going on. The quieter of the 2 boys, Dylan, is being haunted by a group of ghost children possessed by the Bagul, the infamous boogeyman from childhood legends. They take him into the basement of the house to view the films they've made killing their families in order to pull Dylan into the fold and make his own family snuff film. Naturally, our deputy main character, now a private detective, figures out the process the Bagul uses to lure in children with the help of a friend and tries to break the cycle. Now, what I mentioned just a moment ago about trailers showing too much is a point that needs to be made here before we continue. In seeing how much of the film was centered around the group of ghost children and hearing them speak while knowing we'll be experiencing the ritual through a child's viewpoint this time, I fear that the impression I got from the trailer was going to stick to the film. Too close to the monster, mystery's lost. Sinister was a powerful film because it captured the idea of a found footage horror story perfectly. Man finds something odd, man plays tapes, man discovers the most disturbing collection of films in his life, wrapped in mystery through no source, no information, and no explanation. As he watches, the house is revealed to be haunted and the paranormal force behind the films is making itself known. But not known nearly enough for us to lose our fear of it. The absolute foundation of fear is lack of knowledge. What we don't know about scares us in the same way a dog will back away from a stranger's hand if one reaches out to pet it. It's the feeling of, I don't know you, I don't know anything about you or your intentions, so I'm afraid until I learn more. There are multiplying factors for fear, like threatening visuals or the sight of something that is meant to hurt you or just shouldn't exist, but that's the number one crossbeam for constructing fear. Keep us in the dark as much as possible while turning up the threat volume. Sinister knew how to do this all the way through, and even when we learned a little bit about the Bagul, we still weren't close enough to it for the fear to die down. Sinister 2 exists on the premise that we actually know what's happening based on what we learned at the end of the first film, and as a result, it's a lot harder to be scared. When you as a viewer know way more about the monster and what's happening to victims than the characters do, you won't feel the same fear as those characters. There's no surprise, just the hope they'll figure it out and fix things. Being able to relate to characters in this way makes horror and mystery work, especially if the characters feel like real people. Sinister 2 actually does an excellent job of establishing realistic, likable characters that you do grow attached to. They're people, and they've been fleshed out much more than the standard stock character in horror films. However, that omnipotent knowledge we get from watching the young boy chosen by the Bagul undergo his process of meeting the ghost children, watching the films, struggling with nightmares, that all makes the sequences lifeless. These kids aren't scary anymore. We know too much about them and are spending way too much time in their company, not being threatened. What Dylan's doing isn't scary because we know exactly what's happening. The only real fear and thrill akin to Sinister in the scenes where Dylan watches snuff films comes from watching those films ourselves, because they're still so shocking and bring us right back to the horror Ellison Oswald experiences watching them in the first installment. There's a later portion of the film with the camera being used as action plays in the current story where this also works because it's so foreign and does have the air of suspense and the unknown. There's a genuine tension in the scene. The same issue of being too close to the ghost children possessed by Bagul also follows the monster himself. We get way too many close-up shots of the Bagul, and he just stops being frightening. Again, we know too much, we've seen him too often, and the pieces in which we see him show the Bagul in such a non-threatening way that it's hard to feel afraid. The characterization of our ex-deputy turned private eye and the single mother Courtney is fantastic, and it does bring me to my next point. Have you ever heard the phrase in the field of writing, sagging middle? It's a symptom of poor writing in which the beginning is strong, the end is strong, but the whole middle section becomes boring and suffers bad pacing amid other writing problems. Sinister 2 actually has the reverse problem. It's a very slow burn to get to the point where you recognize this as a genuine sequel to the first film. The first third of the film kept me in fear that the ride just wasn't going to really get good enough for the cost of boarding, but the middle restored my faith and set me at ease that there were aspects of the film I could finally enjoy. It even carried through on the promise it delivered halfway to the end, but the last 5 to 10 minutes were so abrupt and dry that it felt as if the character building, humanization, and other good writing aspects were abandoned for sake of just finishing the thing. It's for this reason that I have to stress how important a director can be, even if the writers remain for the sequel. Sinister and Sinister 2 have exactly the same writers, but the result of changing directors for the sequel is so jarring, you can tell that the crew has shifted positions and exchanged responsibilities in ways that didn't benefit the creation. The fear, the tension, the incredible detective atmosphere and mystery of the first film were almost entirely lost in the second. In the end, Sinister 2 stands as a decent sequel to its first installment, not an equal film. After leaving the theater, I even asked a couple who I'd seen in another pair of seats what they thought, and their response was the same thing I was thinking. Too much of the ghost children, not nearly enough of the detective work, and overall, not as good as its first piece. I loved the main character as a character on his own, and especially loved how a sidekick from the first film's events became the new focus to carry the torch. I did love the few detective pieces we got in the film, and I loved the special nod to anyone watching during the inevitable ritual towards the end where the audience's one wish whispered to one another in the seats is instantly fulfilled with no chance of a takeback. But as a whole, I just can't love Sinister 2. It had very good intentions and there were several examples of strong writing and intelligent people behind the script, but so much of what made the first film great and what makes horror movies great was left behind. I'm giving Sinister 2 3.5 snuff film reels out of 5. Better than average with a strong middle section, but not nearly good enough as a whole to remember fondly. Better luck next time with the third inevitable installment, I suppose. That's it for all of my thoughts on Sinister 2. I wish it had been a little bit stronger, but again, we're kind of used to this thing with sequels to major horror films nowadays, which, as sad as it is expected. If you have any comments for me or questions, just leave them below and I'll definitely reply to you. I want to hear your thoughts on Sinister 2 if you went to the film as well, or if you were thinking of going. If you just want to talk Sinister itself, let me know as well. I'd love to talk about the first film with you guys. Once again, I'm Nick Nocturne, and thank you for tuning into Nightmind. If you enjoyed this review, give a like, and subscribe to join the Creatures of the Night to catch more reviews, news, and upcoming attractions. Our own Nightmind double feature is coming up very shortly, and as majority has ruled recently in a poll I took, it seems that as soon as the first half is done, it's coming up with a slight intermission in between. I promise it will not be long. Thank you all once again for joining me in the dark this evening. I'm Nick Nocturne, and just like the Bagul, I'll be seeing you again real soon. Sleep tight.